Here's the thing about empathy. The real danger isn't that we've lost it. It's that we've focused it. Empathy hasn't disappeared. It's just become narrow, tribal, reflexive. We feel deeply for those we see as ours, our people, our family, our team, our political party, our echo chamber, our side. And that empathy is real. It's powerful. It moves us to act, to protect, to rally, to grieve, to fight. But when empathy is only extended inward toward those we identify with, it doesn't make us better humans. It makes us more divided ones. But what happens when someone else's pain threatens our story? What happens when their suffering challenges our comfort or implicates our tribe? We pull back. We rationalize. We minimize. We dehumanize. We say, well, they shouldn't have been there. That's not our problem. They're just trying to make us feel guilty. They brought this on themselves. This is weaponized empathy. Not because it's fake, but because it's unexamined, because it's real and it's fiercely limited. It connects us, but only to some of us. It draws a tight circle around who deserves care. And when people outside that circle ask to be seen, we call them dangerous. We call them dramatic. We call them the enemy. And that's the most dangerous thing about empathy. Not that it fades, that it concentrates, that it becomes a spotlight and not a floodlight, that it binds us so tightly to our in-group that we become numb to everyone else. This episode isn't about performative empathy. It's not about bots pretending to care or brands saying we're here for you in soft font and grayscale. It's about real empathy, the kind that moves you, the kind that saves lives, the kind that makes you willing to sacrifice, but only for some. And when that kind of empathy becomes the default, when we mistake intensity for integrity, we lose the very thing that makes empathy worth practicing. So today we ask the harder question. What happens when empathy stops being a bridge and starts becoming a border? This is Empathy in the Age of AI, Episode 2, Weaponized Empathy. Let's start with something uncomfortable. Tribal empathy is not moral failure. It's our biological default. We are wired neurologically and emotionally to care most deeply about the people closest to us. The ones who look like us, live near us, talk like us, pray like us, vote like us, make us feel seen, safe, and mirrored. Our nervous systems are ancient. They didn't evolve for pluralism, they evolved for proximity. Thousands of years ago, empathy for your in-group wasn't just natural, it was necessary. It helped you survive. You protect your tribe because your tribe protected you. And you care about their pain because their pain was your future. You help the child, the elder, the injured, not out of abstract morality, but because keeping them alive kept you alive too. Empathy was an advantage, but it was never equally distributed. It wasn't designed for fairness, it was designed for practicality. Modern neuroscience backs this up. Our mirror neurons, the system that lets us feel what others feel, light up more intensely when we witness pain in people we identify with. There are MRI studies showing that we literally process the suffering of us more vividly than the suffering of them. We don't just empathize differently across group lines, we biologically empathize differently. And unless we become aware of that, it governs us without our consent. Now, this doesn't make us bad people, it just makes us people. It explains why it's so easy to feel devastated by tragedy in your own neighborhood, and so easy to scroll past the same tragedy multiplied 100 times in a faraway city, or a border, or a continent. It's not that we don't care, it's that our wiring is selective. And unless we interrogate that selectivity, unless we get curious about who we automatically care for and who we instinctively other, we never get beyond it. And here's the problem in 2025. We are living in an interconnected, globalized, hypermediated society with the empathy of a cave clan. Our reach has expanded, our obligations have expanded, our reflexes haven't caught up. And that gap between how much empathy the moment demands and how narrowly we distribute it, that's where things start to break down. Because when we fail to evolve our empathy, we fall back on its oldest shape, us versus them. And that's how you get nationalism draped in compassion. That's how you get war crimes justified as grief. That's how you get political violence defended as family protection. It all starts with care. Care that's real, care that's unexamined, care that's exclusive. So the question isn't, do we still have empathy? The question is, who do we believe deserves it by default? Because that answer, the shape of our unconscious loyalty, will determine who we forgive and who we fight for and who we will allow to suffer. So let's talk about what happens when tribal empathy scales. What happens when leaders, institutions, and movements realize just how powerful that emotional reflex is and decide to build systems on top of it. What you get is nationalism. What you get is war. It's policy that protects our own at the expense of everyone else. It's storytelling that weaponizes grief not to open hearts, but to harden borders. Because empathy, when channeled narrowly, becomes an engine for justification. It feels like love. It feels like protection. It is protection, but only for some. And that's the playbook. You see it in immigration rhetoric. We need to protect our communities. Our neighborhoods are at risk. Think of the children. You see it in war propaganda. They bombed our homes. Our families are grieving. They started it. And all of that may be true. The grief is real. The fear is real. The need for safety is real. But empathy used this way doesn't solve the problem. It makes it binary. Our loss matters. Theirs doesn't. Our pain is sacred. Theirs is strategic. Our side deserves compassion. Their side deserves punishment. The language gets slippery fast. You'll hear things like, we welcome immigrants, but the right kind. We're not racist. We just care about American families. We value human rights, but we have to defend our culture. These are empathy-flavored statements. They soothe the speaker. They validate the audience. They sound humane, but they're doing emotional triage, deciding quietly who counts. And it's not just the rhetoric. It shows up in policy. Who gets social support? Who gets asylum? Who gets forgiven? Who gets shot and who gets spun into a sympathetic headline? A black teenager gets gunned down in a hoodie, and suddenly people want to know his grades. A white school shooter gets profiled as a troubled loner who loved music and needed help. Same violence, different empathy. This is how propaganda works. Not by lying outright, but by shaping who you care about, who you picture as a mother, who you picture as a child, who you picture as a human. And once that empathy is activated for your group, your nation, your identity, it becomes a powerful shield, a rationale, a moral high ground. So when the tanks roll in, when the police crack down, when the families are separated or lives are lost, the story is already there. We had no choice. We had to protect our people. We're the ones who are hurting. Weaponized empathy doesn't look like hate, at least not from the inside. It looks like loyalty. It looks like care, like home. And that's what makes it so effective and so hard to challenge. Because if you question it, you're seen as cold, as unpatriotic, as detached. But what you're really doing, what we need to be doing, is asking, what's the cost of caring only for our own? And who keeps paying that cost over and over while we mourn, fund, legislate, and retaliate in the name of grief? Let's take everything we've just explored, tribal empathy, the instinct to protect our own, the emotional gravity of belonging, and plug it into the most powerful behavior-shaping tool of our time, social media. Because if tribal empathy is our hardware, the algorithm is our operating system, and it's running 24/7. Social platforms are empathy machines, not because they expand it, but because they exploit it. They don't show you the world, they show you your world, your people, your fears, your losses, your villains. They learn what stirs you. They study what makes you stop scrolling. And over time, they begin to sculpt an emotional landscape that feels real, but is actually highly curated, intensely narrow, and emotionally reinforcing. This is how tribal empathy becomes not just instinct, but infrastructure. You see your community pain on loop, your group's victimhood, your team's moral clarity. And you don't just feel empathy, you feel righteous empathy. The kind that confirms what you already believed, the kind that sharpens your sense of who you think deserves compassion and who doesn't. The outrage hits harder, the tears feel more personal. And every time you engage, share, comment, react, the platform learns. more of this, show them more of this. And just like that, your empathy becomes content. And your content becomes identity. And your identity becomes a filter. This isn't just a personal habit, this is a systemic pattern. And it changes the shape of public conversation. We talk about raising awareness, but awareness has become siloed. Awareness without reach. Awareness that collapses the world into your feed. And so two people can be grieving on the same day in the same city and never know the other exists because their pain isn't in your feed. Their community isn't yours. Their losses don't light up your corner of the internet. And this does something subtle but corrosive over time. It trains us to believe that empathy is a zero-sum game. That caring about them means betraying us. That if your attention goes there, your loyalty might go with it. So we stay inside the loop, and the loop tightens. We post our grief, we defend our tribe, we silence the other tribe's pain because it feels like a threat to our own. Not because we're cruel, but because the system makes it feel like we have to choose. And here's the heartbreak. Most people are trying to care. They're donating. They're speaking out. They're crying for strangers. But the way these platforms work, that empathy never really leaves the room. It circulates, it intensifies, it echoes, but it doesn't expand. Because the systems we're using weren't built for empathy that scales. They're built for engagement that spikes. So what we're left with is empathy burnout on one side and empathy inflation on the other. One group numb from overexposure, another group high on moral clarity. Neither side seeing the full picture. Just two mirrors facing each other, each convinced they're the only ones reflecting the truth. Let's talk about what happens when narrow empathy isn't just emotional, but operational. What happens when it gets coded into systems, policies, legal justifications, and media narratives? Because this isn't just theoretical. It shows up everywhere. It shows up in courtrooms. It shows up in policing, in war, in family law, in international conflicts, in headlines, in local school board meetings. And what it reveals is we will forgive almost anything if we feel emotionally aligned with the person doing it. Let's start with policing. How many times have you heard this? The officer feared for their life. That phrase, feared for their life, is an empathy trigger. It invites you into the officer's fear. It asks you to feel what they felt in that moment of uncertainty, of chaos, of supposed threat. And once you feel that fear, the logic follows, of course they reacted, of course they fired, of course they survived. And just like that, the empathy closes the case. It wraps the violence in moral justification and humanizes the shooter while anonymizing the shot. And that's the move. Not denial, not erasure, just redirection. In foreign policy, it sounds like we had to act. They gave us no choice. We can't let our people be targeted again. And the word our does all the heavy lifting. It draws the circle. It defines who gets protection and who becomes collateral. Because once the story is emotionally anchored, once our empathy is lit up for our own grief, our danger, our children, anything else becomes tolerable. We may not cheer the harm, but we will explain it. We'll defend it. We'll tell ourselves it was necessary. Empathy becomes the reason not to look too closely, to not question too much, not to ask about the other side because we already know they started it or they provoked it, that they're dangerous or they're lying. They wouldn't do the same for us. So our actions? Always reluctant, always justified, always tragic but righteous. And theirs? Always monstrous, always political, suspicious. This shows up in family systems too, in custody battles and abuse cases, in cycles of harm that get passed down and rationalized. He was just under a lot of stress. She didn't mean to snap. You don't know what they've been through. And again, all of that may be true, but what does that truth do when it's only applied to one side? What happens when empathy becomes so directional that we stop believing that someone else's pain counts? This is what I mean when I say empathy can excuse harm. Not because it's fake, but because it's partial, because it turns violence into protection if it's done by someone like you or someone you love. It turns cruelty into stress relief if it's coming from someone you understand. It turns injustice into just the way the world works, if the person being hurt isn't you. And when that becomes habitual, when we internalize it as truth, we stop being curious about suffering. We just categorize it. This is what real-world fallout looks like. Not dramatic, not always evil, but constant and deeply human. It's the ache of feeling seen only when it's convenient to someone else's story. And if we don't name it, we keep reinforcing systems that call themselves empathetic while quietly deciding day after day who doesn't count. Let's bring the machines into the room, because the series is called Empathy in the Age of AI after all, and we haven't forgotten about the AI part. And what we've been exploring so far, tribal empathy, weaponized empathy, selective care, emotional loyalty, that's human. But now it's code. Now it's architecture. Let's be clear. AI doesn't feel empathy. It doesn't care. It doesn't feel anything. It doesn't have a body or a memory or a lineage of pain. It has training data, which means it learns from us, scarily from Reddit data, conversations on the internet. And if what we teach it, explicitly or accidentally, is how to prioritize some lives, some grief, some values over others, then that's what it learns to simulate, and simulate it will, very convincingly, very fluently, and very efficiently. We're already seeing this happen. AI chatbots that tailor their tone and warmth based on cultural cues, some designed to flatter and others to deflect. Customer service bots that treat affluent English-speaking users with more deference. Generative systems that apologize for errors in American accented English, but default to cold syntax when the user's name isn't familiar to the system. It's not intentional or malicious, it's inherited. It's our tribal empathy, but at scale. Because when we train these systems on human patterns, they don't just learn syntax. They learn who we care about and who we don't. There's also a growing trend in AI, empathetic agents, bots that care, that mirror concern, that say things like, "I'm so sorry you're going through that. That must be really difficult. I'm here for you." Now, those phrases matter. When no one else is around, when someone's in crisis, when silence feels unbearable, those simulations can help. But let's not mistake empathy simulation for moral imagination. These systems can only reflect the values they've been trained on. They cannot ask, who is missing from this conversation? They can't say, wait, whose story isn't being told? They just echo what's already loud. If what's loud is nationalism or misogyny or white innocence or male fragility or Western exceptionalism, then the AI will empathize right along with it, because it's not checking your moral compass. It's optimizing for pattern coherence. And if the pattern says, this group is usually the victim, it'll echo that back. If the pattern says, this demographic tends to apologize, it'll build you a script. It doesn't care if your grief is valid, it cares if your grief is recognizable. And if your pain doesn't fit the pattern, it doesn't get reflected, it gets erased. This is the real danger of AI in the empathy space. Not that it fakes care, but that it amplifies narrow care. It scales the selective emotional logic we already use, and because it's so fast, so convincing, and so fluent, we start believing it's neutral. We start trusting it more than we trust each other. Because it's always available, and it never flinches. It never asks anything back. But empathy without accountability is not connection. It's emotional outsourcing. And if we're not careful, we'll build a world where you don't have to examine your biases, because the bots will reflect them right back to you, but with a reassuring voice and better grammar. All right, let's shift now from diagnosis to discipline. Because it's easy to critique narrow empathy, it's harder to live differently, to widen the circle, to stay open without falling apart. But that's the work. Wide empathy isn't natural. It's not instinctive. And it's not efficient. And it sure isn't comfortable. But to practice wide empathy, you have to care about people whose pain disrupts your worldview. You have to feel with people whose politics offend you, and you have to sit with grief that you didn't cause, but you benefit from. You have to look at someone you've been trained to fear and say, what happened to you? Not to excuse, not to explain away, but to understand, to stay human. There's nothing soft about that. Empathy, when practiced wide, is a radical act because it risks the loss of certainty. It puts your moral comfort on the line. It exposes you to stories that implicate you, And that's where most people get really uncomfortable. Because wide empathy asks more than compassion. It also asks for curiosity. I've seen this done, not in grand speeches, but in quiet defiance. Like the veteran who went to protest for refugees and stood shoulder to shoulder with people his country had been told to fear. Like the nurse who kept treating prisoners even after one of them assaulted her, not out of martyrdom, but out of conviction. Like the teacher who refused to call a student illegal, even when the district said she should. These aren't people who are better. They're people who chose to stay open when every part of the system said to tighten up. They chose to be porous, not because it was safe, but because it was right. This is what it looks like to practice wide empathy in a fragmented world. You stop asking, do I agree with them? And start asking, can I see their humanity? You stop needing the narrative to line up neatly and start being willing to sit with contradiction. You stop performing empathy in public and start practicing it in private where no one is watching. And it doesn't buy you anything. Empathy is an agreement. It's not approval or endorsement. It's just the refusal to reduce someone else to a caricature, even when your story would be cleaner if you did. And that refusal, that's where moral imagination begins. We're taught to confuse loyalty with love, to believe that to care deeply for our own group, we must close off to others. But the truth is, empathy isn't a betrayal. It's a practice, a daily choice. To be present, to stay human, to see someone fully, even if they can't or won't see you back. And look, I'm not saying that it's easy. It's not. Sometimes empathy costs you peace. Sometimes it costs you reputation. Sometimes it costs you community. But the alternative is numbness. It's mimicry. It's a world where we only feel for those who vote like us, live like us, look like us, and suffer like us. That's not empathy. That's allegiance. And we've already seen what that kind of allegiance can justify. Let's talk about loyalty, because at the center of narrow empathy is an idea we don't examine enough: loyalty. Loyalty to our group, our story, our framing of what's right, what's safe, and what's true. Loyalty tells us who deserves protection. Loyalty tells us who we can grieve. It tells us who we're allowed to forgive and who we're not. And in a lot of ways, loyalty feels like virtue. It feels like commitment, like clarity or strength. But if we don't examine it, loyalty becomes a cover. Because loyalty says, I care about you because you're mine. But empathy says, I care about you because you're human. And those are not the same thing. Loyalty is easy to weaponize. It shows up in every conflict. We stand by our people, our community first. I know he messed up, but he's one of us. And it sounds noble until it doesn't, until it justifies abuse, until it justifies violence, until it silences the victim and defends the aggressor because they wear the right jersey. That's when loyalty stops being love and starts being complicity. So how do we break out of that? What do we use emotionally, cognitively, ethically, to push beyond the gravity of group identity? This is where moral imagination comes in. Moral imagination isn't about being soft. It's about being brave enough to imagine lives you haven't lived, to see someone whose story doesn't flatter you, to hold their pain long enough to realize that if your life had gone just a little differently, it could have been you. It's not about pretending the world is fair. It's about acknowledging that it's not and choosing to care anyway. It's what allows a prosecutor to see a defendant as more than their worst moment. It's what allows a soldier to see a target as someone who used to rock their daughter to sleep. It's the ability to stretch beyond reflex, beyond comfort, beyond narrative. And in a fractured world, it might be the only thing that can help us outgrow tribal empathy. So ask yourself, who do I empathize with automatically? Who do I defend without question? Who do I instinctively minimize, rationalize, or dismiss? Who do I never imagine as fully human because it would cost me something to do so? And if you find those edges, don't run from them. That's where the work begins. Because empathy, that thing that costs you nothing, that challenges nothing, that disrupts nothing, isn't empathy. It's just social gravity. But empathy that dares to stretch, that might be the most human thing left. Empathy is easy when it reinforces your story, when it makes you feel righteous, when it confirms you're one of the good ones. But what about the empathy that costs you something? What about the kind that forces you to pause the narrative you've always lived inside and ask yourself if maybe it's incomplete? What about the kind that forces you to see the person your friends joke about that forces you to feel the grief of someone your side has already decided is dangerous? What about the kind that makes you feel uncomfortable at the dinner table, or in your group chat, or your own body? That's the empathy I care about. The kind that doesn't serve your ego and doesn't boost your profile, doesn't flatter your side. The kind that slows you down and makes you sit with someone else's pain long enough for it to change you. Not agree with them, not excuse them, not even to understand them, just to see them fully, even if it complicates things, especially if it complicates things. So here's my ask. This week, in your life, widen the circle. Empathize with someone you've written off, someone you've categorized, someone your instincts say doesn't deserve it. Don't do it for them. Do it for you. Because if we don't practice empathy that challenges us, then we're not practicing empathy. We're just decorating our tribe. This is Empathy in the Age of AI. I'm Ivor. Stay curious, stay human, especially when it would be easier not to.